Wow, what a special event this is. Let me just begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here and to be in this company here at the CBMW Pre-Conference. I can't imagine a topic more fitting for the sort of cultural situation we find ourselves in than the topics that will be discussed today and tomorrow, and just a great lineup of speakers. It's a real privilege to be a part of it with you. In my brief time this morning, I'm going to go a little bit of a different direction than perhaps many of the other speakers already, and even ones you'll hear about later today. In fact, I was looking over the speaker titles, and I realized, man, mine really stands out as sort of an oddball here. Most of the time when you hear a speaker talk about men and women's issues, most of the time it's going to be largely focused on key texts of Scripture. It's going to be exegetically oriented. So you can talk about Genesis 1 through 3, 1 Timothy 2 and 3, Ephesians 5. In fact, the prior speaker did all that wonderfully. In fact, you'll hear many speakers do that wonderfully this week. Many have done it already in the past. So I thought I'd do something a little bit more sort of different and unique today. I want to take us back in time a little bit in our brief moment today. I want to go back all the way to 2nd century Christianity. Now, I know that sounds like an odd time to go to. You may wonder, why in the world would you spend your brief moments talking about Christianity in the 2nd century, and how's that relevant for biblical manhood and womanhood? But believe it or not, it really is. It's on my mind for a number of reasons today. First of all, I've been doing a major research book project on Christianity in the 2nd century for the last couple of years, so it's sort of fresh on the brain. And one of the things I've been amazed at as I've looked at this project is how often sort of men-women issues come up in early Christianity. That's one of the reasons I think it's important for us to discuss it. There's another reason, and that is the uniqueness of the time of the 2nd century. Now, I know most of us probably don't think much about that time. Actually, that's part of the reason why I think it's critical to mention. Most of us think about the time of the apostles, 1st century. Then we think about the time of the early church hitting its stride, maybe 3rd, 4th, 5th century. But then tucked in the middle is this sort of forgotten century, the 2nd century, where Christianity is just learning to walk on its own with baby steps. Post-apostolic time period, they're finding their way, and as they do so, they enter into one of the most hostile environments imaginable. The Greco-Roman world, as well known, was not a hostile or not a friendly thing to Christianity. Christianity was a cultural pariah. It was not respected. It was not liked. It was seen as socially insubordinate, culturally subversive. It was seen as problematic in all sorts of ways in the ancient world. Christians wouldn't bow down to the Greco-Roman gods. They wouldn't pay homage to the emperor. They were not liked and viewed with suspicious all around. And it was that environment that Christianity began to make its way. And it's that environment, as I'll see in a moment when we get to it, that women began to join the early Christian movement in droves. There's a third reason, though, I think this time period is really important, and that is because of what people in the modern day say about it. You know, much of the discussion in the modern day about men and women is mostly a critique about modern Christianity, and it says that modern Christianity is oppressive to women or hostile to women or as a negative environment for women, and most people see that in the modern day and assume that in the past that that's the way it was as well. They say that the reason Christianity, they think, is hostile to women in the present is because it must have been that way in the past. The reason it's hostile to women now is because that's the way it was in early Christianity, starting, of course, with the Apostle Paul in many people's minds, and then moving on to the 2nd century time period, where Christianity is viewed as a very negative, hostile environment. But I want to ask the question this morning, is that portrayal of early Christianity really true? Is it really true that Christianity was this place that women found to be negative, oppressive, hostile, and difficult? Here's what I want to do in just a very short amount of time. I want to ask the question about what role early Christianity played for women. And we're going to discover that women loved early Christianity, particularly in the 2nd century, and were driven to it in great numbers. And then secondly, this morning, or this afternoon rather, I want to say a few words about why that might have been the case. Why might women have found early Christianity attractive? So just two things. Why in the world was it attractive? And then before that, what do we see about what is going on in the 2nd century with women? Let's start with the first one here. What do we see about the popularity of Christianity for women in the 2nd century time period? And here's where we could spend a lot of time going through the early sources, and we're not going to do that obviously today. But here's the nutshell version of it. When we look at Christianity in the 2nd century, Christian women are everywhere in our sources. It is really remarkable how often women are popping up in all our historical sources. As soon as Christianity is mentioned, women are all over the place in it and find it to be a wonderfully friendly and inviting environment from front to back. The sources that show this are countless. One example, one of our earliest Roman governors, a guy named Pliny the Younger, who persecuted Christians. When he looked for Christians to torture for information, who did he find? 2 young women. One of the apostolic fathers, Ignatius of Antioch, a lot like the Apostle Paul, regularly mentioned women in his letters, all the time talking about what they're doing, what their activities are, how busy they are. He greets them by name. He talks about what they're up to. And they're busy doing all kinds of things, just like they were in the first century, also in the second century. Women are hosting churches in their homes, hosting house churches in their places of living. Women are helping the poor and visiting those in prison. Women are traveling missionaries. Some of the most wealthy women are patrons and helping the church financially. And on it goes. Women are busy in all our second century sources in early Christianity. And then on top of that, it's not just that women are busy doing all these things. We find out that the gospel is spread even to wealthy people in the second century, particularly wealthy women. Justin Martyr, one of our earliest stories, tells us that women in the aristocratic circles, the wealthy circles, were converting to Christianity in great numbers. He tells stories of this. In fact, he tells one famous story of a woman who converted to Christianity. She was a wealthy, aristocratic woman. Her husband, who was not a Christian, found out she converted, decided to divorce her because of it, and after he divorced her, in a final act of spite, turned her into the authorities. And in that day and time, to turn someone into the authorities as a Christian was as good enough to have them arrested and thrown in jail, and that's exactly what happened to her. Another early Christian writer, Hippolytus, tells us an amazing fact, and that is one of the early Greco-Roman emperors by the name of Commodus, one of his mistresses converted to Christianity. This is an amazing fact. Commodus, who was in the late 2nd century, who was a Greco-Roman emperor, had many mistresses. One of them became a Christian, and she began to witness to the emperor Commodus. Now, she didn't have much success, but if you know anything about who the emperor Commodus is, he's the emperor that the movie Gladiator focused on. He was a wicked man historically, not quite as bad as the movie made out, but nonetheless, he was a wicked man, and his mistress comes to Christ. She begins to witness to him as another example of how women are coming to Christianity in amazing numbers. In fact, so extensive were women converts in early Christianity that pagan critics would often mock Christianity for being too pro-women. I just want that to settle in just for a moment. Christianity had so many women as part of its early movement that early pagan critics were, in a sense, making fun of Christianity as a religion of women. They were, in fact, too pro-women for most people in the Greco-Roman world. Think about how opposite it is today. People accuse Christianity of being anti-woman, but in the ancient world, in fact, they were pro-women and being mocked for it. In fact, what's interesting about this sort of mass flux of women into early Christianity is it was at a time when Christianity was wildly unpopular, but yet was incredibly popular with women. Now that's a fascinating thing, because when you realize that a person in the Greco-Roman world in the 2nd century had every reason not to convert to Christianity. No one was forcing women to become Christians. There was no cultural pull to become Christians. There was no societal obligation that would make someone think they ought to become a Christian. And yet when we look at our historical sources, time and time again, we see Christians in this time period largely composed of women. In fact, statistics are a little hard to come by here, but a number of scholars have done some interesting work on this. The scholar and sociologist Rodney Stark has actually explored the statistics of men and women in the 2nd century, and he concluded that in the 2nd century time period, roughly the Christian population was 2/3 women, about 1/3 men. What that meant was, it's this interesting little stat, is that actually that's the inverse of the broader Greco-Roman population. So if you were in the sort of pagan Greco-Roman world in the 2nd century, and you were hanging out there, it would be about 2/3 men and 1/3 women. But if you went to the Christian circles, it was about 2/3 women and 1/3 men. Now, I suppose if you were a Christian man in the 2nd century looking for a Christian spouse, that'd probably be pretty good news, right? Statistically, you had a good shot at finding a Christian wife. Actually, not such good news for the Christian women in the 2nd century, who incidentally had a hard time finding Christian husbands, which led to a whole other host of interesting problems in the history of Christianity we won't get into here. Here's the upshot of my first point. When you look at early Christianity, doesn't it all appear, based on the historical evidence, is it was a religion that was hostile and oppressive and negative to women. In fact, on the contrary, women were going against the cultural trends. against the Greco-Roman sort of sensibilities, against their husbands even, and against everything that would push them outside of Christianity, and they were drawn to it in massive numbers. What you see is that Christianity proved to be a very friendly and hospitable place for women in the early church. Now, of course, that raises a natural second question. That is, well, why in the world was that the case? What was it about second century Christianity that made women so attracted to it? Now, of course, men were attracted to it too, but just not in so many numbers, and it makes you ask the question, what could have been going on in second century church to make women come in such numbers? And here's where we can mention a few things that scholars have thrown out as possibilities. I think a number of these are really backed up by the historical evidence. So several suggestions of what might have made Christianity so popular with women during this time period. First, and probably first and foremost, Christianity gave women real opportunities for ministry that involved honor and dignity. Here's one of the amazing things about religions in the Greco-Roman world. Religions in the Greco-world were so dominated by men, but that women had no role at all. But in early Christianity, that wasn't the case. In fact, in early Christianity, women had all kinds of opportunities for ministry. I listed out a number of them a minute ago. We have women who are on the mission field doing work. We have women going to prisons and visiting people. We have women that are hosting churches in their houses. We have women helping the poor. We have women doing all kinds of incredible, important, and essential ministries in the early church. And that was in contrast to what was going on in the Greco-Roman world, where religions, for the most part, were so dominated by men that women could do absolutely nothing. Now, make no mistake about it, during this time period in the second century, it's not as if women were ordained. It's not as if they were bishops or pastors or ministers. No, there was essentially a complementarian structure to the church during this time period. But yet, women in massive numbers found it to be a place that they could do ministry in a meaningfully and blessed way. And that's something very distinctive about Christianity. Another possible reason why Christianity attracted women is that they condemned roundly female infanticide. You may not know it, but in the Greco-Roman world, it was not uncommon at all, because of the favoritism towards men and against women, to have a female baby and leave it out in the elements to die. Female infanticide was widespread in the ancient world and fairly well accepted, but not so for Christians. Christians condemned female infanticide, and for that matter, all infanticide. Another possible thing that attracted women to Christianity is Christianity condemned female child brides, interestingly. It was not uncommon in the Greco-Roman world to marry off daughters at an extremely young age, even as young as 11 and 12 and 13. And once again, Christianity, it was the Christians that stepped up and said, we don't know and don't think that this is healthy, and so they were not for it. It attracted women into their midst. A fourth possibility that attracted women, this is particularly noteworthy, is that Christianity condemned divorce, and Christianity condemned the use of mistresses and concubines. Now, in the Greco-Roman world, even as evident from the Emperor Commodus we just mentioned a moment ago, it was quite common for husbands to have mistresses. Not the women, but the husbands. And often, if husbands weren't pleased with their wives, they could divorce them, would have left them in tremendous financial distress in the ancient world to be divorced and be a woman in that time period. It was Christianity that condemned divorce. It was Christianity that condemned the use of mistresses and concubines and upheld the family unit. One final possibility of why Christianity was popular for women is that it condemned abortion. Once again, not just infanticide, but also abortion, which was widespread throughout the Greco-Roman world. What's interesting about a number of those points, and no doubt you've already sort of piecing this together in your own mind, you're realizing that a number of those points, if followed, would actually produce thriving, growing Christian families in the early church. I mean, think about it for a moment. If you condemn infanticide, then you're not going to have infanticide in the Christian midst, and it's going to grow Christian families. If you're for stable marriages where spouses are together and they aren't divorced and the husband's not sleeping around, you're going to have more Christian children in stable families. If you don't have a culture that's for abortion, you're going to have more children and more stable families. And what began to happen in early Christianity, because of this friendliness to women and because of the women coming in, what happened is a very stable home family unit that made Christianity thrive in the ancient world. All of that flies directly in the face of the common cultural claim that Christianity is a hostile environment to women. So as we sort of draw this to a close this morning, and again, just a few brief comments on this, What I want to do for you is just lay out some historical dimensions to the debate and the conversation today. We look at it exegetically, we look at it theologically, and rightly so. Those are the places we always want to start. But hopefully today this is a chance for you to think about it historically. And historically, what I want to encourage you to see is that the charges that Christianity is hostile to women in the present and that Christianity is hostile to women in the past, neither of those are true. Certainly we would disagree that Christianity is hostile to women in the present, but we certainly have all kinds of historical evidence that women did not find it at all an oppressive hostile place in the past. And if that's the case, then that should be an encouragement to all of us as we stand for truth in this very important debate about biblical manhood and biblical womanhood. Thank you very much.